Hey guys, and welcome to week 5 of VBA. So this week we're looking at if statements, which is probably the hardest thing that we've looked at so far. Now, it's kind of sucky that we only have 1 week to work on this. I wish there was more, but we only have 1 week, so we're going to do what we can to try and cover as much as we can about if statements as possible. Now, so far, what we've focused on is we only focused on programs that run linearly. So regardless of whether they have for loops or whatever the case is, the program hasn't had to make any decisions. All it does is execute the instructions that you give it in a linear fashion from top to bottom, and then obviously looping around, whatever the case may be. But it's always top to bottom without any sort of branching or decisions that the program has had to make. If statements allow the program to make a decision. So what I've drawn up here is a quick flowchart. So flowchart are ways that programmers use diagrams to represent their programs. Now, it doesn't matter what the shapes are. Well, it does matter what the shapes are, but you don't need to understand what the shapes mean. It's just that a diamond usually represents a condition, whereas a rectangle represents an action. So basically, let's say you have some if condition, okay? And that condition can be either true or false. If the condition is true, then you progress down this stream and you execute what is in the then command, okay? If the condition is false, you progress through what is in the else command and you progress down this route. So as you can see, when you have an if statement in your program has to make a decision. Is this true or is this false? And it has to take the corresponding path depending on whether it's true or false. So in a sense, an if condition is much like an intersection. It makes your program make a choice. Do I go down this path or do I go down this path depending on what you've done? So I'll give you a real life example here, which makes a lot more sense. So let's say my if condition is if I have done my BFC 3540 homework. If this is true, meaning that I have done it, then I will go to sleep. Else, meaning that if I haven't done it, then I will begin it now. Okay, so you can see that that you're making a decision as to whether to go to sleep or whether to do some work based on whether you've done your BFC 3540 homework or not. Okay, so if you have, then you progress down this path and then you go to sleep and then whatever. If you haven't, then you progress down this path and you begin it now, and then you take a completely different chain of events. So that's what if statements allow you to do. They really allow your program to make decisions, and also they allow your program to branch out into different lines of code depending on the condition. Okay, so we'll go on to Excel now and look at what we have to do for this week. Okay, so after you've entered your name and authenticated and all that, we have the first worksheet here on if statements 1. So this sheet is very easy, and I'll demonstrate to you basically how if statements work. Now, instead of just copying this across to here, we want to copy it across such that if this is bigger than 5%, then the corresponding cell is going to say big, okay? So let us think about what it means in terms of this diagram of the if statement. So if it's bigger than 5%, meaning that it's true, then we're going to say big. Else, we're just going to copy the cell as is, okay? So let's try and implement that in VBA code. So I'll make this a bit bigger so it's a bit easier to see. And then I'll launch the VBA editor by hitting Alt F11. And we'll go to if statements 1 right here. Okay, so we're going to if statements 1 right here, and we'll begin by just writing a simple sub called sub if statements 1. Okay, now inside the sub, what we're going to do is we know that in order to copy this to here, we're going to have to use a for loop. So we can either, the easiest way to do this in my opinion is actually to name this something. So let's name this input. And from now on we can refer to these range of cells right here as input, okay? So let's define variables for the number of rows and columns. And we're going to count the number of rows and columns of input and put them into these variables. You should be very familiar with how to do that by now. So basically we're just taking the number of rows of the input, what we named input, and we're putting it into no rows, and similarly for the columns. Now we know that we're going to need a for loop or a nested for loop in order to go down the column and across the row to copy that across to here. So how about we set up the structure of that for loop? Okay, so I've used I to loop through the columns and J to loop through the rows. So basically, let's start off by showing, I'm going to start off by showing you the anatomy of an if statement. Okay, so basically with an if statement, you have if, and then you have some condition, and then you have, I know it's an error, but I'll just leave that for now because I'll get back to there. You have some statement, then you're going to have then, and then you're going to have an else. Okay, so actually, I'll do it this way. So I'll enter it in so you can actually see what's going on. Okay, so first of all, we're going to have some input from this input range here. Okay, so this is the input range. So if input.cells, and then remember here, J refers to the rows, so it's going to be J comma I because it's rows comma columns. Now notice that I sort of switch around the I and the J's because I don't want you to get into the routine of thinking that I refers to columns or rows or J refers to columns or rows. They're just counts, okay? So you can loop it however you want. So the reason why I do it many different ways is to show you that it doesn't matter which way you loop it as long as you loop across the row and also down the column, okay? It doesn't matter the order in which you do them. So if the input cells.j comma I is greater than 5%, let's see if I'm right here. Yep, greater than 5%, so greater than 0.05, then, hang on, what did I do there? Sorry, I realized what I did. So it's actually range input, okay? So don't make the same mistake I did. Then, what do we want to do if range input.cells is greater than 0.05? Then, we're going to output big rather than what it is, okay? So if this is true, so let's refer back to here. So if this is true, then you go into the then body, okay? And the then body is going to tell the program to put big into the corresponding cell. So if this is true, then let's go back to here and see which cell it starts from. This starts from B41, so you can use the int range B41.cells command. Range B41.cells J comma I is equal to big, okay? So we're going to put big in there, else. So this means that if it's false, so the else will be down here. So this is what happens if it's true. It's going to execute the then command. If it is false, it's going to execute the else command. So if it is not bigger than 0.05, you want to just copy it across, right? So it's going to be range B41.cells J comma I is just going to equal range input.cells J comma I, okay? And remember that whatever you're assigning to is on the left and what you're assigning from is on the right, okay? So we want to assign whatever's in the input into this set of cells right here, or we want to assign big into these sets of cells right here. And now just a VB thing, after you've done your if statement, you have to write end if, which signifies that this is the end of the if statement, okay? So let's run this code and see whether it works. And as you can see, if you go through and check that wherever it's greater than 0.05, it's input the string big there instead of whatever the return is for that particular day. Okay, so let's move on to if statements 2. Here we're using if statements to count, okay? So this is, again, not difficult. So essentially, the way that you use if statements to count is that you have to have some sort of count variable, which increments each time the if statement is said to be true. Okay, so let's say you want to count whether how many people in a class are taller than 1.70 meters. So you're going to feed in their heights. Now, every time a height is taller than 1.70 meters, it triggers this true statement. And in here, you'll just have a count that increments by 1, okay? So, for example, if the first person comes in and yes, they're taller than 1.70 meters, the count increments by 1. The second person, true again, increments by 2. The third person, false, it doesn't increment, okay? So, in a sense, it only triggers that increment when it goes through the then statement. So let's go back here and I'll do this first, but I'll explain, before I do this, I'll explain another important concept, and it's called it's called logical operators, okay? So basically there are a few logical operators that you need to be aware of, including and, or, and exclusive or, okay? So basically what they mean is that, let me open up a brand new sheet here. Now, essentially, let's say you have and should be very familiar, okay? It means if you have A and you have B, okay? B. So if A is true and B is true, then the and statement will be true, okay? For any other combination, including false true, true false, or false false, the and statement will return a false, okay? So in order for A and B to be true, A has to be true and B has to be true, okay? Now for or, it's a similar thing, except when you're using ors, it means that these two here can also suffice, okay? That means that if A is true or B is true, then A or B is true, okay? So it means that one of them is true or both of them are true. It satisfies the or command, okay? The third one we want to look at is XOR, or exclusive or. So exclusive or means only one is true, but not both, okay? It means that, it basically means this, okay? So if A is true and B is true, it will return a false. If A and B are false, it will return a false, obviously. So it would only return a true when either one of A or B is true, okay? So the way you would think about an and is both. The way you would think of an or is one or more, and the way you think of exclusive or is one and only one. Okay, so basically if only one is true, then the exclusive or will return a true, and in all other cases it will return a false. The or and the and, I think most of you are familiar with from basic everyday language. So if you look at this here, the number of times FMG and PRU have positive returns is referring to the and command. The second one is referring to the or command. And the third one, because it says specifically not both, it means it refers to the exclusive or command, okay? So we have to try and incorporate these into the condition for our if statement. We'll call this sub if statements too. Okay, and now inside the sub, we're going to start by looping across the rows and the columns. So how about we call this returns again? Actually, we'll call this input again. So actually that's not going to work because this is already called input. So I have to call this input too. And how about we define counts for the number of rows and columns of input and write a for loop that is going to allow us to loop through said input. So what I've done here is I've just copied across basically the code from the previous worksheet because it's exactly the same thing, right? Except here, instead of having input, we have input 2, okay? Now, the stuff in here is going to change. Now, I'll delete all this because that's all going to change, but the loop remains the same, okay? We're still basically looping through the rows and columns of our input 2 matrix. Now, let's say we need some sort of a count. So we'll define the count as an integer, okay? Now, the number of times that FMG and PRU both have positive returns. Okay, so FMG and PRU, actually, I need to make a modification to the code. Realize here that you're looping through both rows and columns. We actually only need to loop through the rows, okay? So basically, let me loop through the rows only. So we only need to loop through the rows. Okay, and we're going to have an if statement. Now, if FMG has a positive return, it means range input 2 dot cells. It's going to be I, comma 1, because 1 refers to the first column, remember, that's FMG, is greater than 0, so that's a positive return, and range input 2 dot cells, this one's going to be I, comma 2, because PRU is in the second column is greater than 0, then, okay, so let's see if you understand the logic for that. So basically what we're doing here is we're saying if the input to .sales I, 1 is the return for FMG is positive, and also the return for PRU is positive, then what we want to do is increment the count by 1, okay? So count is equal to count plus 1, yeah? And that's all. That's all we want to do. There is no else, because if it isn't, then we just ignore it. We just discard it and move on to the next, right? So we don't need an else. So basically, this only happens if this is true. If it's not true, then we just ignore it. So that's all we need, and we'll just end if there. And then here we can output the count to cell A27. Okay, you should know how to do that. Range A27 dot value is equal to count. Okay, so let's see if this successfully counts how many times they both have positive returns. And it says 4, and I can clearly see that those are the 4 right there. The rest, hang on, this isn't quite right. I think the problem here is that I think this might be inputting as exactly 0. So it's really these 4 here that it's successfully counting, okay? And I think that's the right answer. So we move on to either or both have positive returns. So basically it's exactly the same code here, except instead of using and, you'll use or, OR. And of course, you remember to output it to the correct cell, A29 instead of A27. And for the last one, instead of using and, you'll use exclusive or, so XOR, and you'll output it to cell A31 instead of A27, okay? So that's very easy. It's just exactly the same code, except modified slightly to give you the correct answers for this section right here. So let us make this big again and move on. Okay, so copy the weekly returns with the 6 stocks into the cell below. If the stock is less than -2%, then it should contain this text. If the stock is greater than 5%, then it should contain this text. And if it has a negative return and at least 3 other stocks have a negative return in that week, then the corresponding cell should say bear market, and any stocks that have positive returns in that week should read contrarian, okay? And condition 3 takes precedence over conditions 1 and 2. Essentially what this means is that, well, if condition 3 takes precedence, it means that we check it last, okay? And we apply it last. So regardless of what happens in 1 and 2, 3 will be the one that's always applied last. So let us think about how we can approach this problem. So first of all, let's say we copy a value into here. So these 2 conditions are easy. We can just check it if the stock is less than 2%, -2%, then we can input this. If it's greater than 5%, then we can input whatever. But this is a bit harder because this actually requires us to do several things in a very specific way. First of all, it requires us to copy rows, okay? And the reason for that is if we go down the column and then go down the column this way, we won't be able to check this until the end. So this really forces us to copy individual rows rather than individual columns. So you want to loop the inside, you want the inside loop to be the rows and the outside loop to be the columns. Now, what you want after that is that if you have to have some sort of a count, okay? So if a stock has a negative return and at least 3 other stocks also have a negative return, so essentially you want to trigger this count if the count is greater than 4, the number of stocks that week that have a negative return is 4 or greater, then you want those stocks to say bear market and the ones that are positive to say contrarian. So for example, in the first week, this will be triggered because you have at least 4 stocks with negative. So these will say bear market, and these 2 here, FMG and PRU, will say contrarian. So the way we do this is going to require a lot of if statements. So how we go back to here and we try to really nut this out logically one by one. Okay, so I'll move this up and then we'll create a new sub called if statements 3. Now, what we need to do first of all is we're going to need 2 loops. We're going to need one loop that loops across the row, and we're going to need one loop that goes down the column. So I'll just copy, actually what I'll do is I'll go back to this and I'll copy this over. and make sure it's all indented correctly, and we'll change these to input 2 because that's what we name these sets of cells right here. Remember, input 2. Now this is exactly what we want. So basically, actually, is it? J is equal to 1 to no rows. This is the opposite of what we want. So you see here how the inside loop is going from 1 to number of rows. That means that it's actually going down the column because the column length is number of rows, right? So we want to switch this around. Essentially, we want to have the number of columns which is going across the row to be on the inside loop. Okay, so let's delete all this logic because we don't need this. And we'll change this around. So this is going to be no columns, sorry, no rows. And this is going to be no columns. So I is now the row index and J is now the column index, okay? But the inside loop, the J loop, is going through the number of columns, essentially meaning that it's going from left to right because J is changing, right? The column is changing, the row is staying the same for each outer loop. So let us think about what we're going to do from here. Now, we know that this is right. Okay, so we'll implement the code for 1 and 2 first, and then we'll think about implementing the code for 3. Now, implementing the code for 1 and 2 is quite simple. So first of all, let us go through a different case. Okay. Now, up until now, we've only we haven't done nested if statements. So if you look here, we've only done if, then, and else, okay? We haven't done nested if statements. Nested if statements are a way of allowing us to check more than one condition, okay? So let's say you have if some condition, then something, if another condition, then something, and if a third condition, then something, okay? So basically, what we have now is rather than having this, you have perhaps three things that it could be. Now there are two ways of implementing this. We can either implement this using else if statements, or we can implement this using select case. Personally, I prefer select case, so that's how I'm going to implement it. But your tutors might prefer to use else if. I don't like using else if because I think it gets really clunky and difficult to use. Okay, so basically, the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to show you how you use a select case statement. Okay, so the first thing you need to write is select case, and then you're going to have to tell VBA what you're basing the select case out of. And here we're basing the select case on what is inside the cell for input 2. So that's going to be range input 2. Dot cells I comma j, and notice that it's I comma j because it's rows comma columns, okay? And then we end the select case with an end select, and that's basically how we specify a select case. And now we're going to have multiple cases in here, okay? So the first case is case less than -0.02. Okay, that's the first case. And then what we want to do in that case is we want to set range. This starts from B45 dot cells I comma j is equal to less than 2%, right? That's what the thing tells us to set that equal to. So it's going to be less than -2%. Okay, so basically it's going to go in here and it's going to say, is this true? Is it less than -2%? If it is, it's going to print this, okay? Now the second thing you want is case greater than 0.05. Now if that is true, I know it's case is, but it autofills that for you, which is why I get sort of lazy and don't type that. Now if this is true, then it's going to print greater than 5%, okay? In cell B45. Okay, and that's what you want to put in there. And in the third case is called case else. It means if it is neither less than -2% nor bigger than 5%, then it's just going to copy the value across, okay? So B45 dot cells ij is going to equal this, right? So it's just going to copy that directly across without typing any of this. So we'll run this first. We'll see that it doesn't sort of do this whole contrarian bear market thing, but it should modify these correctly such that the ones that are less than -2% will say that, and the ones that are greater than 5% will say that. So let's see if it works. And clearly you can see here that the ones that are greater than 5% say this, and the ones that are less than -2% say less than -2%, okay? Okay, now the way in which we're going to implement this code is we're going to have some sort of a count, okay? So if a stock has a negative return and at least 3 other stocks also have a negative return, then the corresponding whatever, okay? It doesn't matter. What we have to do now is create a variable that will be able to count the number of negative stocks for us. So let's define a count variable as integer. Now, this interior loop here is looping through the row, okay? So essentially, every time that this interior loops through, we want the count to increment by 1 if it is negative, okay? So essentially, you want an if statement in here. If range input 2 dot cells I comma j is less than 0, then you want the count to be equal to count plus 1, okay? And end if. This is exactly the same as what we've done before. So this count will increment by 1 if it detects that this is less than 0. Now the next step is, so that's it, okay? So that's it for the interior loop, because that's all we want to do. We just want it to, as it goes across, it notes down how many returns are negative. Now, once it finishes that entire row, so once we're out of this loop and back into the main loop, what we want to do is we want to count how many there are that are less than 0, and if it's greater than 3, so it says 1 stock and at least 3 other stocks. So if it's 4 or greater, we want to trigger some code, okay? So we're going to have to use an if statement. So if count is greater than 3, which means that it's either 4 or above, then end if, okay? So if it is greater than 3 or above, we want to trigger some code, okay? Now the code that we want to trigger is, we want to input in here contrarian if it's positive and bear market if it's negative, okay? Let me check if that's right. Yep, so the stocks that are negative should read bear market, and the ones that are positive should read contrarian. Okay, so let us go back to here. So if it's greater than 3, then what do we want to do? We want to go again back through the row. So it's going to be again for, let's use a different variable this time. For k is equal to 1 to no cols. Next k, okay, and now inside here we're going to have to have some code. If the return, i.e. if range input 2 dot cells I comma k, remember k is the variable that we're using here, because k is now the variable we're using to loop across. So if this is okay, if this is greater than, actually less than 0, then we want to output range b45 dot cells I comma k, and what we want to put in there is bear market. Else, what we want to put in there is going to be I comma k contrarian, okay, and that's all, right? End if. So now let's see if this works. We know that the first one should this should apply to, so let's run this code. Ooh, and we see we have a situation where they all say that, do you know what I've done wrong? I already know what I've done wrong, but I want to know if you can spot it. Essentially, we have to remember to reset the count back to 0, otherwise the count keeps accumulating as we go through the different weeks, okay? So at the end of this if statement, once we've evaluated it, before we again loop through the next week, so the next I means we're going on to the next week, we'll have to reset the count back to 0. So let us run this code again, and you can see that that fixes up the problem, right? So a big part of doing this is understanding where you've made mistakes, and I realized that straight away when I saw that, just because I sort of noted before that I should do this, but I didn't get around to it. Okay, so what we're going to do now is, let me see how many sheets we have left here. We have 2 sheets left. So I think these 2 sheets are a little bit more difficult. So actually, mathematical functions is very easy. It's just the if statements 3 is a bit difficult. So how about we leave that for the next video, for week 5b. And for the rest of this video, we're going to debug this right here and see how this works. So we're going to really see how it inputs variables into here, such that it turns out the way it has. So before I do that, I'm going to write a sub to clear. Okay, so this code right here will clear everything inside these cells, and it's cleared. So we'll ignore this code now. We can delete it. So it's very quick to write code to clear it. You should know how to do that all the way from week 1. And what we're going to do is we're going to create some watches. Now, there's no point really creating a watch on no rows and no columns because they're static and they won't change. So you can sort of just find out what they are by hovering over them. We know what they should be anyway. But it might be interesting to put some watches on these cells. So how about we put a watch on this? So this will give us what the, actually, no, we'll put a watch on this. So this will give us what the input is. Okay, and we'll keep a watch on count, so we can see how it counts and where it goes through. Okay, so now that we've kept a watch on those and we've put a breakpoint on here, let's run the code and see what happens. Okay, so we've pressed play and now we're going to use F8 and it should skip to this statement right here. And we'll go through these because you know what they do. So basically we've looked at, we've counted the number of rows and counted the number of columns, so they're 10 and 6 respectively, and you should understand why that's the case. Okay, that's obviously no surprise. Now we're going to go through the loop, and first of all, I is equal to 1 and j is equal to 1, and here range input dot cells ij is equal to 3.8 whatever to the power of negative 10 to the negative 2. So that's going to be this return right here. It's going to be 0.0383. So let us think about this for a second. Which of these cases is that going to go through? It's obviously not less than negative 2, and it's obviously not greater than negative, 0.05. So it's going to go through this case else statement here. So let's see if this is true. Okay, we'll go back here. It checks this. It's not true, so it doesn't go through to the code. It checks this. It's not going to be true, so it skip it, and then it checks else. So it means that if this isn't true, it'll go through this code. So it'll go in here, it'll run this code, and you can see that it copies this into here. Okay, and select. Now it's going to check whether it's negative, and it's not. So it won't run count is equal to count greater than. Sorry, it won't run count is equal to count plus 1. It'll just go to the end if and go to the next j. Now the next j means it moves over to this cell right here, 0.00. Now it'll go to the select case again, and of course it'll go to case else, and we know why, because it's not, none of these two things are true. So I'll just skip over that, case else, it'll run this code and copy it in, as you can see there, and select. It's not less than 0, so it's not going to go through the count. It'll just go straight to the end if, and then it'll move to the next one, which is a and z here. Okay, so again, this one is actually less than negative 0.02. So as you can see, when you move on, it'll go through this code right here, and then it'll run this code. Okay, so it'll input less than negative 2 into this cell right here, rather than going through the case else, as we've seen before. And once it's done that, it goes straight to the end select because it's satisfied. And now it's going to check whether it's less than 0. And it is. So it'll add 1 to the count. So you can see here count has changed from 0 to 1. And then it goes to the next cell. Okay, and it's going to check Ben. And now this is, again, it is less than negative 2. So it's going to go through to this case right here, as you can see. And then it'll go straight to the end select, inputting the same thing as A and Z. And it'll also increase the count by 1. So see how the count is 1 here. It goes and it checks whether it's less than 0. It is. So the count will increase to 2. And then you go back again, and now j is equal to 5. So it goes on to the next cell, which is TLS. And of course, this is negative, but not less than negative 2. So it'll go to the case else, but it'll also increase the count by 1. So you see it skips over both these lines of code. and it goes to case else and it'll execute this. So it copies that directly in. And of course here, it'll go through the if statement, through the then block, because it's negative, so the count will increase by 1. As you can see, the count is now 3. And then you go on to the next one. Again, this one will go through the case else, and also, it'll also go through this count thing because it's less than 0. So it skips over that, and it goes through this line of code here because neither of these apply. And then it would also go through the then block, and the count will increase to 4. Okay, and that's the end of the interior loop. Okay, so we've successfully copied one row. Now we're going to go through and check whether there's more than 4. If there's 4 or more stocks that have a negative return. And we can see that it's definitely the case here. So if count is greater than 3, which it is, then it's going to go through this loop here. So it's just going to check whether these are negative. If it is, then it'll change it to bear market, and if it's not, it'll change it to contrarian. Okay, so the first one is not, so it'll go through contrarian. So it goes through the else, it goes through contrarian and if, and then it goes through again. Now it checks the second one. The second one is also not less than 0, so it'll go through the else block rather than the then block and put contrarian. The third one is negative, so it will go through the then block because this statement here is true, so it goes through then rather than else. So it puts bear market, and then you can obviously repeat through and see that it puts bear market for the rest because they're all less than 0, so it goes through the then block instead of the else block. And then here, once we reach this line here, at the end of the row, we set count is equal to 0, and then we go next I. So now I is equal to 2, and J starts back at J will start back at 1 once we step through here, as you can see. J is now back at 1, and we're just going to go through the second column. So again, you can see as we skip through, it inputs them and selects the cases as required. And you see that with this one, because only 1 is less than 0, once we get to here, let us see here. So once it goes through this final one, you can see that count is only 1, and it'll exit the interior loop now, and it'll ask itself, is count greater than 3? It isn't, so it just goes to the end if. It sets the count back to 0, and then it moves on to the next row where I is equal to 3. Okay, so now you're on the third row, and again, you can see you can run through the code, and it steps through as required, and basically it's the same logic all throughout. But my voice is getting sore now because I've been talking for too long. Hopefully this has been helpful in understanding how if statements and select case statements work. If it has been, then hopefully you'll be able to do these tasks. And I'll see you in the next video, week 5B, to round off this task. It's going to be quite an easy video with sort of a bit of hard stuff in there. So come prepared. But yeah, that's all for this video, and I'll see you in the next one for the rest of the week 5 VBA.